And I. Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. What a pleasure it is to have my 20 years, How long have we been for?
Gosh, it's got to be. We first met in probably 1997.
Wow. Well, anyway,
1990, yeah,
longtime
1997.
friend,
Yeah.
Susanna Kearsley, who is one of my very favorite authors of historical fiction. And she's back in Scotland this time around, but she has taken us to France and to Russia and Wales and all over. So we are able to get some of her earlier books. You'll see them up in front, but some of the other ones are not currently available, but we can try. So if there's one that you would like to have gotten today and you couldn't, we'll work on it. So virtual audience, thank you very much for joining us. And Susanna, tell us about The King's Messenger.
Okay. Well, but Barbara knows that when I build a story, it's kind of like me building a snowball. I take a little bit from here and a little bit from there and a little bit from somewhere else. And over time, it grows into the shape of something that can become a book, can become a story. The King's Messenger started with a book that I found when I was wandering through a military used bookstore, as you do. And it was one of those amazing, those amazing.
Can I ask where the military used
in
books?
Port Perry, Ontario, Canada. It's no longer there, but it was a fabulous place. It was this man who had he had medals in a case in the corner that you could buy, like old medals and things, but he also had just stacks and stacks of books and a little sign that said more books downstairs. So you're like, okay, and I went downstairs, and in the back of the stacks was this really interesting looking book from the 1930s that said A History of the King's Messengers. And I thought, well, that just seems like it's up my alley. And I never really knew anything about the King's Messengers. It's a branch of the royal service even the King's Messengers don't know how old their branch of the royal service is for certain. But they're still around. They still exist. There are still King's Messengers as a branch of the royal service. At one time, I don't know if it's still true because I haven't actually talked to a modern day King's Messenger. I should probably fix that, but I haven't talked to a modern day one. At one time, there were only allowed to be 40 of them, 40 King's Messengers of the chamber, and you had to wait for one to die before you could join the service, or kill one off, I guess.
Okay, so I have a somewhat tiresome question, but it does tick-tock back and forth.
Yeah.
Up until very recently, were they Queen's Messengers?
They were Queen's Messengers.
They were.
Yeah, so they're named for the monarch. So it's
what
the
I
Queen,
thought.
the Queen's Messenger, the King's Messenger. Under
Right.
Queen Elizabeth I, they would have been the Queen's Messengers. Now they're back to being the King's Messengers again, which is very convenient for me. But so I found this book that had been written by an actual King's Messenger, and he was sort of, for his own benefit, when he joined the service, he was sort of detailing the history, and he had all these fascinating facts, and I learned all these things, and I thought, well, that's kind of a cool thing to sort of sit on a shelf, and one day maybe I'll put a King's Messenger into one of my books. And in the meantime, as some of you know, if you've ever read any of my books that deal with the Murray family of Abercairny, I wrote a book called The Winter Sea that had a real life historical hero called John Murray, who comes from, his family lived on Abercairny, which is an estate in Scotland. His brother was the laird then in 1707. His brother's descendants are still the lairds of Abercairny. They still live on the same estate. And through a series of accidents that have to do with me being really, really bad on Facebook, and just finding out one day that Abercairny estate still existed, and that they held weddings there, and they did all this stuff, and me thinking that maybe this is something my readers might find interesting. So I just one day, just for my Facebook thing that day, I just said, if you like The Winter Sea, if you like John Murray, you might want to follow at Abercairny. And I thought, that's me done for Facebook for the day. I went off and had a cup of coffee, and I came back, and my feed was full of all these people saying that how much they like The Winter Sea, how much they like the character of John, and meanwhile, I think Abercrombie had gotten, I don't know how many new followers overnight, and they woke up the next morning thinking, what the heck, what happened? I knew none of this because I wasn't on Facebook for the next week or so, and I got a little private message from them that was sort of like, ping, hello, Susanna. This is Daniel Murray Parker from Abercrombie. And I thought, uh-oh. And he said, I'm the husband of Anna Murray, whose father is the current laird, and they are direct descendants of John's brother William. And I thought, uh-oh. He said, we've read your book. And I went, oh, no. And he said, we enjoyed it very much. And I went, oh, okay, that's all right then. He said, would you like to see what John looked like? And he went, I had never seen what John looked like. I had never been able to see a picture of John. I had never read a description of John. I had made John handsome and dashing with eyes the color of the winter sea because that fit my story. And his outlawry certificate from the time of Queen Anne was the only one that my friend who is the head of the search rooms in Edinburgh, it was the only one she'd ever seen that did not have a description attached to it, because normally they would have a description so that you could go pick up the person if you saw him. Made sense.
Kind of like an FBI most
Yeah,
wanted
this
bulletin.
is what he looks like. He has a scar here. He has a this there. But John's did not have a description. And initially I was really disappointed about that. And then later on I got thinking, well, that's actually a good thing because I made him tall and dashing with eyes the color of the winter sea. We'll probably find out he's like, 4'2" with buck teeth and knock knees and not romantic at all. But so I said, okay, let's see what he looks like. And Daniel took his cell phone and walked across to the big house where, his father-in-law, the laird, was living, got up on a ladder over the back doorway, which was where John's portrait was, and he took a picture and he sent it to me. And wasn't John dashing and handsome and tall with eyes the color of the winter sea? I know. And then he just sort of went around and went and there's his brother Robin, and there's his brother Morris, and there's his, father, and there's his grandfather, and there's all these people that I had written about. In one afternoon, I got all their pictures. And I was pretty much on the floor. And then they said, and by the way, next time you come over, do drop in, and, as I was booking my ticket right then, saying, oh, look at that, I'm coming over next month. What do you know? So that was, we've tried to figure out when I think it was 11 years ago. And we're now great friends. They're a tremendous support to me in my research. I could not do what I do without that family. I've watched their children grow up, really, from very small children to young men and a wonderful young woman. But they're amazing, and they've also sort of roped in their cousin, who's a Graham of Inchbrakie, which was another family that I wrote about, and he becomes very instrumental in this. He actually drove me down the route that his own ancestor is chasing my characters in the novel. Alex Graham was driving me along that route, which was kind of fun. But anyway, so I have the I never answered anything short. I'm sorry, but so I have the Murrays.
We have an hour. It's
I
okay.
have the Murrays of Abercrombie, and I've discovered this wonderful family with all these wonderful people in it, and the history and the story, and some of the things they shared with me were the little things like the laird walked across with the handwritten history of the family and put it on the table and said, you might want to have a look at that. And I'm like, okay, I might want to. It's just awesome, all these things they share with me. And in that handwritten history of the family, I find people like Sir David Murray, who I had never really heard of before. But the thing about everybody in their family is they're all people you should have heard of before. They're all people that in their day, in their time, were very well known. Sir David Murray was the closest companion and the only servant who really mattered to Prince Henry, the Prince of Wales, in the early 1600s. And I'll try to, without killing you with the history, which is something I never try to do, try to place you in the right historical place. When Queen Elizabeth I, who we all know who she was, right? Okay. Anybody doesn't know who Queen Elizabeth? Because I don't like to just assume. When Queen Elizabeth I of England died, she had no children. She was not married. She had no children that we know of. She left her crown and her kingdom to the only son of her great rival, Mary Queen of Scots, who we also know, right? Mary Queen of Scots' son, James, by that time was a grown man with his own wife, with his own children. He was King James the Sixth of Scotland at that time. We're talking 1603. He was King James the Sixth of Scotland. When he took over the throne of England as well, he then became King James the Sixth of Scotland and King James the First of England, which is why he has this sort of dual personality in the very long moniker.
Right. So can I interrupt for a
Yeah.
minute? The reason that Elizabeth, I've never been entirely clear that she actually specifically left it to James, but he was her cousin. Her Henry VIII's sister, Margaret,
Yes.
married a king of Scotland.
Yes.
And Mary, Queen of Scots, therefore, and Elizabeth were cousins. So
Yes.
actually, they weren't cousins. He was her, what, nephew?
Well, a cousin sort of removed. Henry VIII's sister had married James the Fifth, who was Mary Queen of Scots's father.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I believe,
Right.
unless I'm getting it wrong.
But I mean, Elizabeth
Yeah.
would have had to go out of her way to disinherit him because
Well,
there
it could have
were-
been done. It could like there were people of her advisors, including her spy master, who had been holding a secret correspondence with James for years, kind of, knowing that Elizabeth was getting old and would one day die, and thinking that of all the people who could be brought forward to replace Elizabeth on the throne, James was probably their best bet. And a lot of these men were kind of keen to have a king back on the throne instead of a woman again. So they were kind of looking to James and holding this correspondence with him.
Right. But
And-
it's important to realize that
Yeah.
James had a terrible childhood. I mean, awful,
Oh, yeah.
And
it was
I
horrible.
think because you do talk a lot in this book about James, and thank you. You talk
Yeah.
about his wife, who is usually an absolute
Yeah.
cipher in historical fiction.
And it's difficult. Remind me to get into this later, but about how difficult it is to write James as well. Remind me when we get into this for
I
that
will
very
do that.
reason.
But
Um,
while on the one hand I find him appalling, on the other hand I really feel for him.
Oh yeah. Like
As he-
young
as-
James had just a horrible life.
Yeah, his father was
Horrible life.
murdered.
He was
his mother-
traumatized. He was, they really did a number on him. I hit a point though where I could no longer use that as an excuse for him for what he then. I could understand. I could understand his motivations, but there comes a point where you no longer use that as an excuse for what you then do to the people closest to you. So it became a judgment call for how to work with James. But James is like, you could totally see how he became. And if you ever read about James's childhood and his youth, your heart will just break. He did not have a good time. He was not, but he was a very, very smart, clever, intelligent, he was one of the smartest kings around. He was just also, a very broken man who caused a lot of pain to a lot of, people around him, but very difficult man to write.
Witches were his thing, in
Yep.
part. Witches. He was
Yep.
a great witch hunter,
Yep.
which is very hard to forgive, I think. But,
Well, It's of the time as well. A lot of, but anyway, so James and his wife Anna had numerous children. They had 2 sons that survived into adulthood and 1 daughter who survived into adulthood. Charles, Henry, and Elizabeth. Henry was the oldest. Henry was the Prince of Wales. Charles most people know about because he became King Charles I. That's the one who got his head cut off in the civil wars of Britain. Charles, like James, believed a king should be absolute, that a king, whatever the king said, went. The people should have no say in it. And again, a lot of that came out of James's childhood, that James just did not want to have anything to do with Parliament or nobles or anybody telling him what to do. He passed that on to Charles. Didn't go so well for Charles. Henry, on the other hand, because James had this habit with his children of farming them out from birth to be raised in other households, the children all grew up surrounded by different people with different ideas. Henry was a very independent thinker. Henry leaned more to sort of the Calvinist idea of Protestantism. He believed a king should rule at the behest of his people. He was very into exploration and very outward looking. He had a lot to do with the settlement of Virginia. Henrico, Virginia is named after Henry. He had a lot to do with the quest for the Northwest Passage. He was very excited about that exploration. He was a great friend of Sir Walter Raleigh. He once famously said, because James had Sir Walter Raleigh imprisoned for most of the time that Henry was alive, Henry said that only my father would keep such a bird in a cage. Sir Walter Raleigh was working on his history of the world. It was dedicated to Henry. This is the time of Shakespeare. So Henry's own court at St. James Palace in London was full of poets and playwrights. Ben Jonson was his great playwright who would put on the masks and plays. Inigo Jones would do the sets. This is the kind of environment you have. So Henry was a golden child. He was handsome. He was athletic. He jousted. Everybody really liked him.
And he was Protestant.
And
right?
but
which is really a key factor in this whole thing.
Well, so was James. James was Protestant.
But
he was Episcopalian, but he was Protestant.
Okay, but Charles, unfortunately, wasn't.
Charles went the other way. But he was of the new. It was kind of like the new generation up against the old generation. The new ideas versus the old. That we have to look outward. We can't continue to tax our people. The way to move forward is through commerce and exploration and trade and, colonizing and doing all these things and not staying inside our houses and continuing to tax our people. So at the time that Henry died at the age of 18, he died horribly. He died swiftly. He died under questionable circumstances. At the time that he died, a lot of people thought that he'd been poisoned. A lot of people thought that his father had done it. It was well known, or it had a hand in it, or had been behind it. It was well known that he and his father clashed. Henry was just he was making plans to go to Europe, to go on the continent with his sister, who had just become engaged, and was about to be married to a German prince. And so Henry was getting ready to go off on his very first adventure of his own after being cooped up himself in a palace. He had all these dreams of going off and having his own adventures. And his friends who were Protestant princes on the continent were really looking forward to showing him, their houses and their lifestyles, and he was hoping to find a bride over there. And then he died. When you read about Henry today, you will read that he died of typhus. May or may not be true, but the reason that you read that is because one single doctor in the 1800s, over 200 years after Henry's death, looked at the evidence that was left behind by the doctors of the time, took the material that fit his diagnosis, discarded all the material that didn't fit his diagnosis, and said, it looks like typhus. And you also need to know that typhus was really prevalent at the time that this doctor in the 1800s was writing up this paper. It was a horrible disease that was happening all around him. He said, that looks like a typhus death. Because of that, every historian since has just said, Henry died of typhus because this one doctor in the 1800s said so. They ignore the fact that Henry was having nosebleeds months before his death, that Henry tended to get sick when he was eating with his father, that some of the people that were close to Henry and his father then did actually go on to poison another courtier about 6 months later, and that was an actual documented fact. So I read all this stuff and I thought, which is usually how a story begins with me. It's like, it became a And into this mix, I have Sir David Murray, who I've just discovered was Henry's almost the closest thing he had to a father for most of his life. Sir David Murray came into Henry's household when Henry was about 4 years old, and he stayed with Henry right until Henry died at the age of 18. He was one of the last people in the room when Henry died. He rode on the funeral. I always forget what the... Yeah, but the whatever. I keep want to say barge, but it's not. It's got wheels. Yeah, yeah. So he was the one sitting there with Henry, looking like he had lost his own son, which in many ways he had. He never had children of his own. He never married. He wrote a lot of poetry, which gave me an insight into his heart in a way that you don't often get with people who don't leave poetry or stories behind them. But so I had this. That's another piece of the snowball. And I had the King's Messenger. And I got thinking, I can put the two together. I could put the two together. And that's how that story started growing in my head. And before I knew it, I had a snowball that I could like throw at something and see what would happen, because that's how my stories always start. It's like, what happens if I throw this at a page? What comes out? What characters are going to walk out of this? And what are they going to do? And if it's right, I get a first line. And once I have the first line, I know I have a book, and then I go from there. So that's a nice short answer to your question. That's right.
That was an excellent answer. I know. There were two really very traumatic deaths. One was Arthur, the older brother of Henry VIII.
Yes.
And I once went, just as a little private tribute to Arthur, I went to Ludlow Castle.
Oh, did you?
Where it turned out I was rewarded that a company was performing Romeo and Juliet on the walls of Ludlow Castle that night. So I was able to buy a ticket. But I thought about that. So because Arthur died, we got Henry VIII,
right,
which was a traumatic thing. And because Henry died, we got his brother Charles.
And the Civil War.
Another traumatic thing, which actually probably led on to the
Jacobites directly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and me, because I had 5 ancestors on the Mayflower. The Pilgrim Fathers, when Henry was alive, the Pilgrim Fathers were just starting to, gather and make their plans and everything. And a lot of them were waiting to see which way the wind blew in England. Who is going to be the king? What's going to happen? James was not sympathetic to them in any way, shape, or form. James did not really like a lot of, James was, in many ways, James was a very pragmatic king. James did not like war. He was the one thing that you have to give James credit for, no matter what kind of historian you are. He maintained peace for an incredibly long time. Like a sort of peace. He was off killing Scottish people in terrible, terrible ways. But he maintained the European peace for as long as he could. He did not want to go to war. But he would repress when he needed to repress in order to appease the people around him who were calling for that. So if Henry had become king, there is a very good chance the Pilgrim Fathers would have stayed in either the Netherlands or England and not come to America. If they had not come to America, I would not be here.
Well,
so there you go.
There you go, a very pivotal moment. So another thing about Henry is well documented that despite the fact that he married and had children, which is first duty of a monarch in general is to provide for an heir, he had many male favorites, and it's not clear whether he was bi.
I would think he was bi.
I think he probably
you mean
was.
James, not Henry. James.
No,
yeah.
James.
Yeah.
No, Henry.
Yeah.
Who knows about Henry?
Yeah.
No, I'm talking about James. That and there have been a couple of other English kings that who was it? Edward II and Richard the II, wasn't it? Yep. No, who was William the Conqueror's older son? Him. Well, anyway, it was thought that he might have been killed in part because of the he was homosexual. So it has crept up from time to time. But however James was, and he clearly had male favorites and all, he did marry and he did have
Oh
children.
yeah, and the courts were very gender fluid back then. I mean, like, you go through Charles II, it's like the libertines and stuff. Everything was very gender fluid. It was not the way that we would think of gender today, and in any
And
sense.
part of
You
that,
know, it's
but given the clothing and the makeup and the
Yep.
hairstyles and all the rest of it,
Yeah.
you could really be gender fluid.
Oh, of
Nobody
course
would
you
even
could.
notice.
Of course you could. And and James, like I said, I have to give James his due in a lot of ways. Like he's a very difficult person to write, because on the one hand, when I started getting into his character, I did go back to his birth. And James always, like, he had a fear of blades, he had a fear of knives, and he will always tell you in his own words, although his words shift around a lot. He will always tell you that that came from the fact that when he was a child, like in his mother's womb, um, his mother was held back. Mary Queen of Scots was held back with a knife to her belly when she was pregnant with James, while Rizzio, her friend and musician, was killed in front of her. And James always figured that that left a trauma, on him as an infant that just carried through his life. He was afraid of assassination. He was afraid of blades. He was afraid of knives. And from the time that he was an infant, he was a pawn for everybody that wanted to rule. His uncles, everybody. He couldn't trust anybody. Nobody, if somebody said they loved him, he couldn't trust that they were loving him or just wanting to use him as a pawn in their game. And I cannot imagine what that does to a child growing up, especially a motherless child whose mother is in prison. And it was a horrible way for him to grow up. But then when he grew up, met a woman who initially, from all reports, their initial years of marriage were good ones. Like, their initial years of marriage were loving and good. He had that within his grasp and just sabotaged it every chance he had. And I don't worry about, who he was having affairs with or what his other lifestyle. That's not the problem. It was how he dealt with his own people around him and the friends he had of both sexes and his wife and his children. And he was a very controlling, hurtful person. And I found letters back and forth because with James, you have to look at his actions. Actions are the language that he used, not his words, because he would say one thing one day to somebody, and then that afternoon he'd be writing something else entirely different to somebody.
In which he is not unique.
No, but in a lot of ways, like when I get back into primary documents of people, a lot of the time, even though they're showing different faces to different types of people doing. And he would do awful things like, he would be saying stuff to people about, to his son, about how to be a good ruler. In the guidebook he wrote for his son about how to be a good ruler. It was a guidebook that was intended to be published. So when he's talking to his son, he's really talking to his subjects about, look what a good ruler I am. And he'd be like, oh, you have to be kind to your subjects. You have to be forgiving. You have to be this. And meanwhile, he's like at the same moment going to his advisors and saying, oh, the way to make the unruly border tribes work and, fall in line is you kill their women and children. That's what you do. And then they'll listen to you. And it's right, he's saying it right there. I won't tell you to do that. I would just say that if you wanted to make them fall in line, he's one of those people, right? And it's just like again and again and again. But he would have a letter to his son, Henry. Yeah, sorry. The book.
At some point, we should talk about the story.
He would have a letter to his son, Henry, where, he'd be like, Henry would be writing to James saying, oh, well, I was talking to Mother and, I explained to her that, yes, you were very angry with her for her not expressing enough sorrow over your hurt foot. And that's why you didn't send her a present, and it was a horrible household to live in. He was just not a very nice guy.
You'll be happy to know that the book actually starts somewhere else. And where it actually starts is with a young woman named Phoebe.
Phoebe.
And she, in the place that she lives, near the royal court,
Bartholomew's.
Bartholomew, right,
St.
is is an irritating young man called Andrew,
Yes.
Andrew Logan, who is the king's messenger. And so this book really starts out as a love story, although it's going to be one of those enemies to friend. I mean,
Yes.
enemies to
Enemies
lovers.
to
That
lovers,
kind of a love story, right? But then it turns out that well, Andrew is sent on a mission, and now we're focused on whether, in fact, Henry was murdered and whether James Murray. And by the way, she's saying Murray, but it's actually spelled Moray, in case you are wondering, which I assume is Scottish.
Scottish spelling. Yeah,
Right,
it's Murray.
exactly.
Yep.
So is in fact the mission he's going on designed to frame Sir David Moray for the murder of Henry? And so we have a love story. We have an actual murder investigation. We have lots of stuff going on. And it does all stem, as you're pointing out, from who James was. But actually, he is not.
No.
He is not the major character carrying the story.
No,
he's the back.
I
the
tend
back
not
part.
to write about the, it might sound like I'm writing about the kings and the queens, but I'm not. I'm writing about the people around them because, like, I like to write about the people they affect and not them. Because to me, the most interesting people are the people that are moving in the fringes of that whole society. You can read history books about the kings and the queens, and you can agonize for days over whether, was he a nice person, was he not a nice person? It doesn't matter. What matters is the effect he had on the people around him, the real people who were living their lives, the ordinary people who were king's messengers or scriveners. Phoebe's father is a scrivener, a scribe, who has to accompany Andrew to write down everything that Sir David says on their journey. The innkeepers that they meet along the way, the ordinary people day to day to day, because most of us, that's who we would have been in that day. That's who I'm descended from, the ordinary people, the people that don't make the history books. And those are the people that interest me the most in the story, what their day-to-day lives were like and how the decisions of those important people affect them. Back when the Book of the Month Club was a big thing back in the early 80s, I got the entire set of Will and Ariel Durant's Story of Civilization because it seemed like a really good deal. You get the whole Story of Civilization as one of your picks, right? And they have a wonderful quote in there, Will and Ariel Durant, about what the story of civilization actually is. And I'm going to paraphrase it because I'll get it wrong, but it's sort of like the story, is often told of, it's like a river. And the river is the kings and the queens and the generals and the wars, and it's almost like a river of, horrible deeds and blood and loud noise and everything. But really, all along the banks of that river, ordinary people made their houses and built their lives and had their children and went about their day-to-day lives. And he said the story of civilization is not what happened in the river. The story of civilization is what happened on the banks. And that's what I try to put in the books, is what's happening on the banks of the river, not what's happening in the river. I try to keep the history in the background and bring the regular people and the love stories and of all kinds, like love story, familial love, like love stories between father and daughter and between strangers and friends and all the people that, all the human things that make us matter as people. Put that forward in front of the history because that's what really is going to matter in the end.
So, Andrew and Phoebe, what if you were sent off on a mission that you knew was probably designed to frame somebody and possibly lead to their death? Imagine Andrew trying to work this out, I mean, it's treason to disobey the king.
Right.
But on the other hand, to deliberately send somebody to execution is a terrible burden
Is a
as
sin.
well.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
it's
So,
a tremendous moral dilemma for him. But meantime, he has to ride for Scotland, right? And so
yep.
when you read about this riding off to Scotland, right, it's
On
always
his
an
on his very
adventure,
grumpy
right? I
horse.
mean, the
Yeah, he's
roads
got
were
a very grumpy
terrible,
horse.
and
Yep.
there
Yep.
were thieves and all
Yep.
sorts of things on the way. So even the journey itself was potentially fatal to Andrew, if depending on who he ran into, right?
Yep.
Meantime, Phoebe, who has in those days women had so little actual quote agency of their own,
Yep.
Phoebe's back, wondering what's happening, right?
Yep. And
Her whole life will depend upon whether Andrew comes back.
Yep.
And survives.
Yep. Literally, because she's not riding a horse. She doesn't ride. She's scared of horses. So she's riding pillion, which is a pillion saddle was a sideways seat, little more than a cushion, sometimes with a single stirrup, sometimes not, that was fastened behind the saddle of the man.
That's because she was wearing clothes that didn't allow her to straddle the horse, right? That's how that goes.
Well, also, yeah, and just because there's you can't straddle on the hindquarters of a horse. You'd hurt
that
the
too,
horse.
but I mean,
so,
I've
yeah.
often wondered though if some of the women didn't just like split their skirts.
Well, actually, they just straddle. Like women did ride astride. They did ride astride, but the pillion was for longer journeys was actually a little more comfortable. This pillion saddle is actually not an uncomfortable thing.
more like a chair.
More like a chair, and you just have to really trust the person you're riding with. And of course, she doesn't really trust Andrew at all. She does not like him. So there's a whole dynamic going on there.
Not a lot different than a motorcycle. If you're
Yeah,
if you were back
that's
on the back of a Harley, it would be somewhat
exactly.
similar.
It's the
if you weren't
same
driving, right? Got it.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's an adventure story. It's a political intrigue story. It's a murder mystery. It's a romance. All kinds of things. Susanna always blends. I mean, there's no particular genre involved other than it's just historical fiction.
That's why the
which I
marketing
think-
department loves me so much. Because they can't put me in any kind of, like, they keep saying, well, is it like a romance? Well, sort of. Is it a mystery? Kind of. Is it, is it like paranormal? A little bit, because Andrew's got second sight. You could do that. Yeah. And, is it historical? Yeah, it's like,
So
so
there-
it's in all the boxes, kind of, but none.
And there are real people in it. And then,
Yep.
of course, there are fictional people in it.
Yep.
So that's where we are. If you read The Winter Sea, many of you probably have, then you will feel more familiar with this. So why does Scotland have such a hold on you? Because, I mean, you have written The Name of the Dragon as Welsh.
Yep.
And the Shadowy Horses, which is my favorite of all of her books, is set in northern England.
It's Scotland. That's Scotland.
Yeah, okay.
That's right over the border.
Is it right over
Yeah,
the
it's
border?
in
Is that
Eyemouth.
where the Ninth
Yeah,
Legion
all the
disappeared?
Eyemouth people be on you if you say it's
Okay.
Northern England.
So we've
All the
been-
people from Eyemouth actually is just over the border from Berwick,
Just
which
over
is
the
why
border.
you're thinking that. But
Okay.
all the people from Eyemouth actually once got out of the pub and went and manned the border after getting out of the pub, which was quite an interesting
Got it.
evening, I'm told. Yeah.
Okay. So
Um,
we've also been to France. We've been to
yes.
Russia. What have I missed?
Italy,
Okay.
few places.
Right. But
Yeah,
somehow
so-
Scotland, you
Always
keep
come
going back there.
Yeah, I have family history. Scotland, Northern Ireland. My mom's family. I mean, I know we keep saying the Winter Sea, but my mom's family are McClellans, who did that. And Carrie McClelland is the heroines. I just sort of stole my mom's ancestry for that one, from Kirkcudbright on the west coast of Scotland through Belfast. My dad's family are like Lancashire, Yorkshire, but probably originally Scotland as well,
The border.
over the border. But I saw Scotland first when I was 10, between the cars of a train, standing up with my dad, going into Scotland, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with Scotland. I felt like I'd come home. And there's something magical about it that no other place really gives me that feeling. London comes close, but Scotland just has a certain hold on me, and my characters talk a lot when I'm there. and I can't really
And
control.
there's certainly plenty
Yeah.
to write about.
Yeah.
For a small kingdom, there is
Yeah.
plenty to write about. Right.
Yeah.
So, who would like to ask questions of Susanna? We stymied you
Yes.
all.
First, I want to compliment you on how your outfit.
Oh,
matches
thank
your
you.
book.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know if that was intended.
It was a little bit. I've had this forever, and when they did that cover, it's like, oh yay, I have something that I can wear, like that'll yay, because usually I don't. But yeah, it's like I match.
Great.
Thank you.
So I was fortunate to read an advance copy of this.
Oh, nice.
So I loved it. And I think all these different elements you're saying, it doesn't fit in one genre. And that's what makes it so wonderful. Because you get the intrigue, the political intrigue with the court. You have the romance going on. You have magical realism in it. You have the mystery. You have manipulative King James trying to get his bidding done. And it's a very compelling story.
Oh, well, thank you.
And it was evident to me how much just the enormity of the research you did going into this book when I was reading it. I was just in awe of how much you would have had to have researched. And so it's your first book I've read by you.
Oh,
For me. And so now I
thank
want to
you.
read your
Well-
backlist of books as well because I'm just hooked.
Oh, well, thank you. That's really kind of you. Yeah, I do tend to. Some people do what they call rabbit holing in their research, which is where you follow a little, the little thing down the rabbit. I tend to rabbit warren, and get lost and pop up with a cup of tea and come back down again. I used to work as a museum curator. But I was also born into a family of amateur genealogists, and if anybody has any family history, addicted people, we tend to go nuts. We can sort of start with one family history thread at breakfast and look up and it's Tuesday. So the research for me is the fun part. Not that the writing isn't. The writing is very fun too, but the research lets me go back to the voices of those people that got left off the page. I tend to find people at the edges of the historical record. I'll find, I found Sir David just mentioned in the written family history of the Murray family and went, ooh. I found a mention of Prince Henry and went, ooh. But I find other things mentioned that I didn't know anything about, and then I have to go learn about it. And then my job then is how do I take all this stuff that I've learned and show you guys this much of it, so that it actually paints a picture. Because if you put it all on the page, it's a flood, and you don't. It means nothing. It's meaningless. It's like me rabbiting on for half an hour about King James, which is had nothing to do with the book. But the because all that isn't in there. There's none of that in there. James walks in, he does something, he walks out again, and you think, oh, here goes a rat bastard. That's really all you think. But I had to do a lot of research to decide. What am I doing with James? Am I going to, how am I going to write him? Because I don't ever make a real person a villain unless I'm absolutely convinced that I'm doing the right thing. If I am not absolutely convinced, I'll create a fictional person because I don't think it's fair. The person's not around anymore to defend themselves, and it's not fair to do that to a real person. But the research is just so fun. And a lot of the time it's an ongoing thing. You write and then you get to something you don't know. They're sitting down to dinner and you think, well, what are they eating? What are they, what are they eating in 1613 and in
Very odd food.
in July or something because
Right.
you had to eat what was available. So then you have to go research it and find out. But I'm really
Lots of
thank you.
spices and other things.
Thank you
right.
so much for taking
That
a
was
chance. I'm
nice.
really glad.
I'm driving my.
Ask you your process, but you answered.
Well,
that.
I'm a pantser. The writers are either plotters or pantsers. I've got
You
some.
spent too much time with Diana.
Yeah. Well, no. But Diana and I. The one thing Diana does. Diana and I go to
You write
this
the same-
conference. She's so kind. We go to this conference. We've been going since 2011.
I
She's
know,
been going forever.
forever.
I've been
Right.
going since 2011, and we've decided that she put it so perfectly once that she kind of puzzles it. It's like building a puzzle, which is similar to how I write, in that you have to find your corners first and figure out your
the
your
difference is
plot
that
and stuff.
lots of people write linearly. In
Yeah.
other words, the story starts and it goes
Yeah.
on. You and Diana write bits all over the
Mhm.
place, and then you have to figure out how they put
Well, that's
together.
because my characters talk,
Right.
right? Which
Well,
scares my
and hers-
father because my father's an engineer and he doesn't like the idea that these people are talking in my head to me all the time. He thinks it's a little odd. But if you're sitting in the bathtub and your characters just start talking and give you a scene, then you're looking at it thinking, okay, well, now where does that go? Because it might not go at the beginning. It might go at the end. You might not know till you get there. It might not even be in the book you're writing, which is very common for my characters. It might be like 2 books down the line. But I don't write in series either. Like I don't. When you go someplace like Goodreads, you'll see this is this series or this is that series. That's something the readers do, and I will never, never, never argue with my readers. I love all my readers, and I understand the need for readers to organize things into. My dad's an engineer. I understand the need to organize. But I write just books, and they're not intended to be read in any specific order. And it's almost like my characters live in a big village, and once I create them, or once they create themselves, then they just come out. They're in this village, living in a little like the King's Messenger will be a house, and Mariana will be a house, and Bellwether will be a ship down in the harbor or something, and they just kind of decide they're going to wander from one house to another and go have tea with somebody. And I never know when they're going to pop up in another book. I'll just be writing, and then a character will show up, and I'll think, well, wait a minute. You were in that book there. And readers will always say, oh, I love how you put the Easter eggs in. I'm like, yeah, that's totally intentional. And it's not even a little bit intentional. It's just sometimes I don't even know who the character is until I'm partway through the book, because it'll be the son of somebody or the daughter of somebody from like 4 books ago, and I have to go halfway through the book to realize who it is, and it's a mess. But the point being that there is no proper book to start with in my Kearsley verse. You can go. It's a village. You can enter through any door, and you're going to meet everybody eventually. So there's no problem. If some of the books are difficult to find, or some of them are, fall out of print or come back in print or something, it's not a strict series like that. I'll let Barbara pick.
Actually, I've been driving myself crazy, which is the right way. I looked down and I thought, it's backwards. I think this is the right side. Does this look like the right side? I'm fooling around
You
with
look
this.
pretty. It
Yeah,
doesn't matter.
One side, this is a total distraction. I looked down and I thought, that doesn't look right, but wait. And then, anyway, I was trying to do something sort of vaguely Scottish in the sense that I could drape myself.
You look lovely.
Well, that's it. But anyway, that's why I've been screwing around with this thing, because I couldn't figure out what was the right side. Now, you had a question right there.
How do you deal with loss and grief in your book, both historically and personally?
Writing for me, so the question for anybody at home is, how do I deal with loss and grief in my writing and in my books, both in the writing and personally? So writing for me has always been how I process life. I've had 2, I would say, major losses that cut deep in my life. Well, now 3. I've lost grandparents. I lost one grandparent that was really difficult. My dad's dad probably was the hardest grandparent for me to lose. But when I was 16, I lost a boyfriend who drowned. I was living in South Korea at the time, and he went on a diving trip in the Philippines and never came back. His wetsuit came back. Deanna Rayburn actually wrote a book that just killed me, because she wrote about somebody's, and Deanna will know this if she ever watches this, but she wrote about somebody's jacket coming back, and the man didn't, and it just killed me. But I have never written a scene or a book that processed that properly yet, and I know I will. So if you ever see a book where somebody's drowning or somebody's boyfriend dies or something like that, then that will be that book. And I also lost my sister in 2005 to cancer. I was writing The Winter Sea at the time. That was a book I escaped into, which may be why there's that level of emotion. in that book. I just totally escaped into that book. But then I also had to process her death in the Rose Garden. For anybody that's read The Rose Garden, that is my sister's ring. And which will mean nothing if you haven't read it, but when you do read it, that's my sister's ring. So for me, that is how I process those losses. That's how I make them make sense, and that's how I immortalize those people. My sister always wanted to be famous, so I made her famous in the Rose Garden. You make sure that person is remembered. You make sure that, and you get it. It's like therapy in a way, but loss is a part of life. And trying to, the older I get, I'm 59 now. So I have lost. I have watched other people experience the same losses that I've gone through. I've watched my parents process my sister's loss. I put that into, how Sir David would have processed losing his son, because I've watched my father. You kind of, it's a difficult scene. I never really enjoy writing those scenes, right? They're difficult, and you kind of go into them with a, but when you get there, it's a very cathartic scene to write. And when you've got it right as a writer, you leave the room with your neck wet. You leave the room with tears on your face, and you have tears on your face every time you edit it as well. And then you're doing it properly for the reader. The reader might not cry in the same way, but you've put the right emotion into it for the reader. And you've also done justice to the character. Because I think you should always be honest in the emotion and showing people that it's okay to have those feelings. It's okay to get through that. We all go through that. We're all going to go through that in life. And the thing I've always loved is, I don't know if anybody has watched the Colbert Report one where he asked Keanu Reeves, what happens? What do you think happens when you die? And Keanu Reeves thought about it for a minute, and he said, well, I know the people we love will miss us. And that's really the essence of loss for me, is, you miss them. And you find a way to put that on the page in a way that feels real. And the older I get, the more people I've lost in different ways. So it's hard. I usually have to take a day after I've written a scene like that. But it's always a good thing to write a scene like that, because it gets it out, and then you're not holding it in, because holding it in is the worst thing. Does that answer your question? Yeah. You're very welcome.
Yes, ma'am.
I love your book.
Oh, thank you.
Boy, talk about rabbit hole. I mean, it's just, you're like right in the scene with these people. And I was curious, because so many of them, I mean, when you're going from present day of the character, and then they go back in time and they go back and forth, I'm wondering, do you yourself have the sight? Have you ever met anybody that does, like a psychic? And when you've been to Scotland and London and all, have you experienced like a presence in some of these places that you've gone?
Okay. So this is being streamed now. So this is like, okay. No, it's okay. I'm a very scientific person. You have to know that first about me. That for me, it's all about, provable scientific things and all that kind of stuff. That said, my way of looking at anything that is PSI, psychic, is that it's kind of, for me, I view it kind of like when we sent up the Hubble telescope, we were able to see things that we could never see before, because all of a sudden we had the technology that allowed us to see those things. I think there are a lot of things that are currently unexplained that nonetheless happen and are studied by parapsychology departments of psychology departments in a repeatable, provable fashion. It's fascinating to get into the actual studies and the papers of psychology departments where they can prove that, you know, you can repeat the experiment and it still happens. You just can't explain why it happens, but you can prove that this person can remote view this. You can sit a guy in this room and he can tell you what's happening across the street repeatedly, provably. We don't know how, we don't know why, but I think it's because we just don't yet have the technology that allows us to figure out, to see what portion of the brain is being utilized, what portion of our body is being utilized. I think it all has to do with energy somehow. I think there probably is a genetic component because, especially when I got into the research for this, it was fascinating to learn how many people in the 1600s, the scientific community in the 1600s, I mean, the really super scientific community in the 1600s, were all about learning about the site, the second site. And they were turning to their friends who had friends in Scotland. And everybody said, West Coast of Scotland. That's where it's from. It's all people from the West Coast. Now, my own family has roots in the West Coast of Scotland. Something else that, you know, I take into account. I have been in places where nobody else experienced or noticed anything, and I have heard and noticed stuff. So, yes, I lived in a house in Wales when I was writing Name to the Dragon, one of Barbara's favorites. And every night at the same hour, there were footsteps that went from the back of the house to the front door, just like your dad checking the door to make sure it was locked. And then up the stairs, past my room, up the next set of stairs, and through the wall. Because it was 3 joined farmhouses that dated back to about 15th century. The first few times it happened totally freaked me out. Yes, I did sleep with the light on every time, you know, the whole time I lived there. But I realized that it was what they call a haunting. It's a repetitive thing that goes on whether you're there or not. It's not interacting with you. It's an impression that is left there by someone that lived. Who knows when they lived there? Who knows? It could have been, you know, in the 50s. It could have been in the 1500s. It could have been, but, you know, and not every, like, you know, my friends slept there and they didn't hear a thing, and I'm still hearing it, right? So it's an interesting phenomenon to me. I have stayed in a haunted hotel room in Asheville, North Carolina, that is a actual documented, the haunted hotel room in that hotel. And yes, I felt she mucked around with my hair.
That's so annoying. I have stayed in that same room at the
Did you,
Grove
the Pink
Park
Lady?
Inn, and it
Yes.
never had a thing for me.
Okay, well, no,
yeah.
she played with my hair and patted my feet, and she was very friendly. But I was researching Bellwether at the time, which has a ghost in it, so I thought I would be an idiot to leave the room because I'm writing about a character that's interacting with a ghost, and she was really super friendly. So, you know, I just stayed there. And the only I've had other things, but the one thing that sticks with me the most is before my granddad died, I dreamed I have dreams, like I dreamed that I was on a train, and I got up and went to the washroom in the dream on the train and came back, and he was sitting in my seat. And I said to him, you know, why are you here? What are you doing here? And he said, I have to go away, and I didn't want to go away without saying goodbye. And then the next morning, my dad called and said my grandfather had died. So I don't know. And I kind of like that there are things in this world we don't know.
Absolutely. I
And
think
maybe
that's great.
someday we'll get the Hubble telescope that shows us or tells us what part of my bizarre brain. The Lord knows they've taken enough MRIs of my brain to figure out. But I don't know why this is happening. But I know it's happened to me, so I don't worry about whether other people believe in it or not. I know what has happened. So,
Okay,
yeah.
Pat has apparently an online question or two.
Yeah.
All the way from Melbourne, Australia. Yes. So our Melbourne, Australian viewer is wanting to know how you keep track of where your characters are when they're meeting up based off of when you're writing kind of, scene-based versus beginning to end?
So when I'm writing scene-based versus beginning to end, how I keep track of my characters, I have no clue. My characters are very, very ornery. Um, I wish I could say that I was in complete control of my characters. When I first started writing novels and going all the way through them, my guide for doing that was Phyllis A. Whitney's Guide to Fiction Writing, and in it she gives this it's a wonderful guide to fiction writing, probably the best one I've ever read. I still use it as a Bible in between books, but she gives very good advice on how to create character files and lists and everything, and I followed everything to the letter, and then my characters walked in looking nothing like I had prepared them for. Like, they just look nothing like it, so I don't even try anymore. If I get that type of scene, where my characters are talking and I write down what they say, and I have this little scene sitting out there, I literally write it down in longhand on a piece of paper, stick it in a binder, and we find out where it links up later. Or sometimes I write it on an envelope on the side of the bathtub and stick it in a binder, and we find out where it links in later, or lose it in my desk and then search for it frantically later. But I don't really keep track of things as much. The only thing I can keep track of is the historical research. I do timeline that because I don't outline the books, but I timeline the research so that I know at any given point in the chronology of the time period that the book is being set in, like say it's from April to September that the book is taking place. I will know for the days of those. If I've been reading a letter or a journal or something and it mentions that it's snowing on a particular day, then I write that down. Or if it mentions that the real life characters were here and here and here, then I write that down. Because my characters might decide that they want to do a scene on a certain day, and then I can flip to my timeline and see what was happening. Was it snowing? Was the ship in harbor? Were they here? Were they actually there? Because if they're not there, they can't be doing that scene, because I'm funny like that. They have to be somewhere else. They have to be where they were actually. They have to play the scene where they actually were at that historical moment in history, because I'm strange. They just seem to manage to take care of themselves. They come in when they need to come in, and they leave when they need to leave. And it's the same with the interweaving of the present and past, or the past and the more distant past. It just kind of stops where it needs to stop and picks up where it needs to pick up. And I don't do a whole lot of the weaving of it. Sometimes my editors will have suggestions in the rewrite that, it would be better if you move this over here, or if you end this a little earlier for impact. You kind of waffled on a little bit long here. Shocker. We could end it here. It would be more impactful, and we could weave this in a little bit earlier, and then you can see it when it's on the page, and you can do it more efficiently. But now the characters just pretty much do what they want, and it's like watching a movie, and I just write down what they do.
Is that the only one?
Other than reading The King's Messenger, just one more from Florida. What would you recommend in terms of reading your books in any particular order, or just jump in?
Jump in. I would say just jump in. Having said there is no order to read them in. If you have both The Winter Sea and The Firebird, and you're sitting like this, I would read The Winter Sea before The Firebird, if you have a chance to. It doesn't matter. They're both readable as standalones. If you've already read The Firebird and have not read The Winter Sea, you haven't messed anything up. There is a teeny tiny little spoiler of The Winter Sea in The Firebird, but most people read through The Firebird and then miss that, so it's fine. They do, so it's just
just too subtle, huh?
Well, no, it's not subtle. It's just that a lot of it's a big book, so you get to the end and you don't necessarily, you get back to the beginning of The Winter Sea, and by the time you get to where it would have been a spoiler, you've forgotten The Firebird. So it's just I don't think there's a right place to start. It's wherever. If you go on my website, you can read the first chapter of all the books for, like I've got the first chapter up, and see which one grabs you, which one you like, and then order it from Barbara, and she'll find it for you. And if the publisher doesn't have it in stock, she will badger them to.
She has actually already badgered them.
She's already badgering
One
them.
suggestion I could make is figure out what place interests you, because as I previously mentioned, Susanna's books move around. So if Scotland is your thing, great. If you want to go to Russia, want to spend some time in Wales, Italy, France, whatever, you could select that way.
You could.
You could, yeah, works out. And the great thing about historical fiction is it doesn't go out of date. So, it's still working right now.
Although that, because my books are like, before the pandemic, they were always present day characters dealing with mysteries that come out of the past. And then when the pandemic started, I didn't know what the present day was going to look like anymore. So I started doing past as the present and then going into the further past. So a lot of and when they came to reprint those books or reissue those books, because I've been writing for 30 years, they would say, do you want to change anything in this? Do you want to update it? And I'm like, you can't really give them mobile phones for the ones that I wrote in 96, because if they had a mobile phone, mystery's done, the book's over. So when you're reading a book and my characters walk into a phone booth, and
what's really going on is your present is becoming the past.
Yeah, so it is the past in the more
right.
distant past. It's still the
just
past in the
how
more
fast,
distant past.
How far past is it is really the question.
So, just take a look at the original publication date, and if it says
Right.
1994, then just realize that that's where my characters are moving, so.
Anyone else have a question? Yes, ma'am, way in the back.
I am actually. It's funny because I had this sometimes happens where I have two books on the go. Very, very, very rarely does it happen. The only time it happened like this for me before was right after I finished The Winter Sea, and I had started The Firebird, and I just couldn't get it going. I could not get it going, and I ended up writing The Rose Garden in between The Firebird and The Winter Sea. And I've been working on a book that will get written called The Shadow Court, which goes a little bit further on in time than this. It has Logan's in it. It has, I'm not going to tell you who, because it will spoil this book for the people that haven't read it, but it has some of the characters we meet in this one. One of them walked in who's a boy in this one, walked in as a 40-year-old man, and I thought this will be fun. And it's actually got a present day component, which I hadn't written for a while, which was really fun. So I was working away on that, but it just wasn't catching for me. For some reason, it just wasn't catching. And then this other set of characters started talking, because, like I said, my characters can be real rat bastards, and they just hit you at the wrong time, when you're, because it's like, well, I want to be writing this one though. This one is the one that I've done all the research for. This is the one that I've done all the travel for. And they're like, well, no, let's listen to what we have to say. So I'm now, I think, working on this other book that seems to be the one that takes over every time I sit down. That originally my editor said, well, maybe it's just your palate cleanser, thing that you'll do before, when you sit down to write, you can do a couple of paragraphs on it and then get into the book. And I think the palate cleanser is becoming the work in progress. And it's a ghost story, romance, love story set against the end of World War I, 1920 Belgium.
New territory.
I know.
Mm-hmm.
So but I'm a big lover of The Ghost of Mrs. Muir. I don't know if anybody else. Like I'm of the generation that was raised watching the TV show, The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, which I adored. I love a good ghost story, and I love the 1920s, and I'm going to Belgium on my way to see my son, who right now is in Luxembourg. I've been to Ypres, but I've never been to Brussels. So I'm going to my son doesn't know this yet.
Antwerp while you're there.
I can't. I've got like literally a day and a half. So I'll be able to go back, but in order to hit my deadline, I've got to whoosh, because I also have to spend the weekend with my poor son, who
Instead of writing your book, come on, what kind of choice is that?
he's my baby. So I have to get to Luxembourg, but I'm tacking on an extra day to.
You go to Luxembourg, have moule frite. You would
Oh,
not
I've had
think
moule frite.
Moule frite in
Oh, I had moule
Luxembourg
frite.
is an experience above all other. It really
Mussel
is.
fries.
You would never imagine Luxembourg, which is landlocked, would be the place to have mussels. But it turns out that they actually are astonishing.
I'm
and they
sure
have a
I'm going to
festival.
be. Although my son has apparently found a really neat Canadian restaurant near the place where he
You're
lives.
going to Luxembourg to eat a Canadian?
Yeah,
Are
we
you
don't
going to
eat
have
Canadian.
poutine?
We don't eat
The single
Canadian
most
food
disgusting.
in Canada.
Oh my God! You're not really going to eat poutine in Belgium.
I don't think they serve poutine. I don't know
certainly
what
hope
they serve.
not.
It's
Try
probably
for chocolate.
It's probably weird things like that they think Canadians eat that we don't actually eat, because that happens a lot. It's like, look, it's like fricassee of whatever we don't
I've
eat.
eaten on Canada a lot, and
Yeah.
only some things are weird. But Belgium is famous for its chocolate, so go with that. Right.
Yeah, that's
All right,
exactly
you know
what
what?
I need.
We've
Barbara.
left people sitting in these chairs, which are unforgiving,
Very
for
unforgiving
an
chairs.
hour. And so I want to thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you so much.
And
Can I say one more thing?
of course,
One of the great joys of coming out and talking to all you people is for me, whenever I get a new book finished, it's not finished until I hand it over to you. For me, this book is actually dedicated to all of you. But the other thing is that the quote that is attributed to Samuel Johnson, that I don't know whether he actually said or not. Nobody knows whether he said it. But the writer only begins a book and the reader finishes it, is one of my absolute favorite quotes ever, because I write the story, I hand it over to you. Each one of you is going to read a different story, which I think is just magic. It's absolute magic. And if you put that book down and read it 5 years from now, you're going to read another story again, because you're bringing your own perspective and your own life and your own viewpoint into that book. And so for me, the book is never, never, never done until I do this, until I pass it to you. And I want to thank you all for finishing my stories. And if this is the first time you're finishing one of my stories, thank you so much for taking a chance on me. And I hope it's the first of many. Thanks a lot for coming out.
no, I need the book underneath it, so you're going to have to hold it for just a minute, right? Okay. So I am going to give away a book which I absolutely adore, and I've been waiting for an audience that I thought truly would appreciate the history. Now, S.J. Bennett wrote